Hey, Twisty here, bass player Reckless Empire. Today I'm going to talk to you about 3 different ways of being able to record your bass with a Helix into an audio interface. 2 of these you'll know, but if you stay through to the end, there's a really cool way I'm going to use an optical interface to extend Helix as an outboard. Let's take a look. So recording bass is great if you want to write music, share some ideas with friends, play along and listen to what you're doing with a rehearsal mechanism. It's great. And there are a number of ways to do it. On previous videos, I think there's a link up here, we have shown you how to use the Helix as a native interface into recording bass. This is great, and for 99% of the time, that's what I use. However, when I'm recording and I need dry signals, because I'm being a bit complex, I'm using dual interface basses and vocals and a whole bunch of other stuff, I need a bit more interfaces than the HX LT will give me. So I use an audio interface, but I still want my guitar sounds or my bass sounds through the Helix. So I'm going to talk about 3 different ways of doing that. One is direct bass to interface, and then using the HX native to provide the tone. The second way is a bit tricky. I'm going to use the digital interface, which has an onboard mixing desk, to output the clean signal and export that into the HX and then record the HX. So that's taking up either 2 or 4 channels depending on what type of bass you've got. The third way is to use an optical cable and link that through to my audio interface as an extension of the audio interface rather than as a separate device. This allows me to have more than the 4 inputs I've got. It now increases it to 6 inputs. Let's take a look at that. Hopefully one of these it will work for you. So firstly, let's talk about the device I'm going to be using. So any audio interface can do the majority of the things that I'm talking about today. It definitely can do the direct interface side. The interfaces I'm looking for, I'm using the Apollo Element 46. The alternative to that was the Universal Audio Apollo series. They are, in my view, and the reviews I've seen, basically very similar. The reason I went with the Apollo at the time was because it had 4 interfaces, which I wanted, not 2. For the price of the Apollo with 4 interfaces, Apogee was much cheaper. The functions I was looking for was DSP processing power on the unit to provide some onboard effects, and also the mixing desk, which becomes important when we start talking about leveraging that to output into the Helix. And the second or third thing is then the ability to have optical interface. So the UAD Apollo has optical info, and the Apogee also has the digital interface. So let's take a look at the equipment that we're going to be using through the video. Using the HX LT, the other devices which would work for this would be the floor or the rack. I'm using the LT. I'm using 2 Radial J48 active DIs. Any DI could be used, or for the first section where we're just going straight into the interface, there is no requirement for a DI. You can literally go straight in. And then over here, I'm using the Apogee Element 46. You can see there are 4 interfaces, and then I've got 2 headphone outs. One is going to a headphone, which happens to be my Mi Pro wireless headphones, which I then use over here. I did that because I could, not required. And then there's the second headphone out, which will then link through to the digital input on the HX using a pair of stereo cables. So let's check out the first interface, direct to the audio interface. So let's look at the interface for the Apogee. So as you can see, it looks like a mixing desk. I have various analog channels. This device I've particularly got is 4-channel. The UAD Apollo will have 2 interfaces. Then importantly, you'll see here the optical interfaces. So when I plug my Helix in, it'll pick up optical 1 and 2. Again, gain, trim, I can turn phantom power on or off, which is important. When I go through the DI, phantom power is important because I've got active DIs rather than passive. They need their power. The software comes with FX. I'm not going to be talking about that, so I can get rid of the send. It has 3 mixes. The main mix, which is effectively you mixing the signal coming through from a playback perspective, not a recording. Recording is based on the gain. Playback is based on the mixing. But it has a second 2 mixes. My understanding is that the Universal Audio platform also has the same. So we're not going to use Mixer 3. The idea is that we use Mixer 2 so that as we get feedback from these 2 interfaces, I'll play those out through the second headphone mix, and that will come out and go into the Helix as a line in. Bit technical, but as we go through, you'll see how well it works. So effectively on this mixer, I'm predominantly using the mic inputs, which will be for the Helix output. I'll be using the second analogs to get the clean direct signal from the bass. And the way I get these 2 here will be either 4 signals split out of the DI, option 1. Option 2, coming out of the second headphone interface and going in, rather than using the DI as a splitter, I'm using the desk as a splitter. And then the third one will then be using the optical in, so that I won't need to reuse these 2 additional interfaces here, because I'll record in and out through the optical from the Helix as if it was now lines 5 and 6. Let's see how we go. I've got Reaper running in the background to capture the sound. I've got the Apogee interface at the front. Analog 1 and 2 are the ones that I've got wired in from the XLR outputs of the Helix. So that's direct recording from the Helix. If I plug the guitar into that, I will get sound through that interface. Analog 3 and 4 are coming out of the DI into the Apogee for a clean signal. So effectively the DIs in this case are acting as a splitter. I can capture 4 signals, 2 wet, 2 dry, splitting from the DI into the 2 interfaces. Helix one's muted, so I'm only getting the sound, playback sound of the clean, direct input. So that's the clean signal. Okay, so this recording is now going to be doing 4 tracks, 2 wet directly from the Helix and 2 dry directly from the bass. The split I'm using is using the DI pedal. The output from the guitar goes to the input on the DI pedal. The DI pedal then goes XLR balanced out, as we were doing before, phantom power through analogs 3 and 4. So I'm getting 2 channels of clean signal direct from the DI. The DI then has a pass-through, which allows me to go out of the DI, splitting the signal into the Helix. The XLR balance outs on the Helix go into analog 1 and 2. For monitoring, I've muted the clean signal, so I'm going to hear the Helix as it is natively in the wet signals. But on the recording side, all of the tracks are armed and all of the tracks will be recorded. But from a playback perspective, I'll be hearing the playback as if I had headphones plugged into the Helix. If I'm playing along to other tracks, they will come through the playback through here. Let's hear what that sounds like. Move on to the next one. This time we're going to do basically the same thing. 4-channel recording, 2 wet, 2 dry. However, this time instead of using the DI to split the signal, we're going to use the audio interface itself. So what I've set up here now is I've still got the analog 1 and 2 coming out of the XLR from the Helix. Analog 3 and 4 is still coming through the DI. But what I'm doing is, instead of using the DI and the pass-through on the DI, I'm using the Headphone 2 output. So here I now have a mixer 2. I've got the signal from the clean channels pumped up, everything else is turned off, and I've got the mixer volume out. And I'm driving some output to the Headphone 2. Coming out of the Headphone 2 jack is a split cable, so it's stereo on one side, headphone jack. One input goes into one interface and another interface on the Helix that I'm using to record the bass. So in other words, I'm using it the same as I was doing with the splitter. You'll see I'm still getting 4 channels recorded here. This should sound very similar to the last version we had. So again, I'm using the DI because I want to do some reduction in the gain. However, I could have done this straight into the Apogee, no DI pedal at all, still have it split so that the Helix is being used as an outboard device for the wet signal only, the dry signal is coming straight off the bass into the desk. With the optical connection, a couple of things we have to set up. One is we need to set the optical in format to be SPDIF. I'm not using optical out, so it doesn't matter, but optical in needs to be SPDIF because I'm using the SPDIF out of the Helix. And I also need to set the clock source. Normally it's internal. I need to set that to optical to allow the Helix to provide the clock source for the synchronization. If you set it to internal, you get popping and some artifacts in the background. Other than that, that's the only setup you need to do. So the equipment you're going to need to connect optically from your HX into your audio interface, there's 3 components. There is the connection that comes out of the HX and goes into a converter from coax to optical. And there is an optical cable to go in from that into your audio interface. The HX LT that I've got has AES EBU outbound digital connection. That means it uses a 3-pin XLR on one end, and I need to convert that to an RCA connection on the other end. If you are lucky enough to have a HX floor or HX rack, you will have that or the SPDIF in and an SPDIF out. The SPDIF uses the RCA connector, so you will just need an RCA male to male. But if you have an LT like myself, you'll need one which is XLR female, RCA male. That then connects into a coax to Toslink connector. Toslink being optical cable. So on the inbound side, coming from the HX, I'm going to go into the RCA connector. On the outbound side, which is going to the audio interface, I then use a standard optical cable and just put that through. The optical cables are keyed, so you need to get it the right way around. And effectively that's it. So this now goes from the Helix into the connector to convert from coax into an optical cable, and the optical cable then goes into the door. That's all there is to it. I got this equipment from Amazon. There's links below. The optical cable was $12 Australian from Amazon. The XLR to RCA connector was $15 from Amazon. And the Toslink adapter was a huge 22 Australian dollars for that. It is USB powered, so it does require power, but apart from that, that's it. So very inexpensive to be able to expand your audio interface with an extra 2 inputs. So mine went from a 4 to a 6. This method allows you to buy a 2 input audio interface like the Apollo Duo or a smaller Apogee or others that have an optical interface on them, and expand them to be 4 or 6 depending on your interface numbers, using the Helix purely as an outboard effects unit without sacrificing those XLR inputs. So for the third and final recording mechanism, this is the best one, I think. It allows us to use the Helix as a pure outboard device, connecting its digital output into the optical input of the interface. You can see here I've now removed analogs 1 and 2, which I can then now use for vocals or anything else. The Helix is no longer outputting through those XLRs. Analog 3 and 4 is the one I have direct from the base into for the clean signal as we've been using. And now I'm using Optical 1 and Optical 2, and you can see I'm getting signal through those 4. From the recording side, I've changed the interface to be Optical 1 and Optical 2. That's all I've done. So now, as I go through, I should be hearing the playback from the Helix like I was before, the wet signal. However, I'm not using up the 2 XLR inputs on the Apogee for that input. So it should sound the same as the last one. There you go. Thanks again for watching. Make sure you click like and subscribe, really helps us. I hope you've learnt something apart from the basic plug it in and record. I'm really excited to be able to use the optical interface on the HX to now make that an extension or an outboard device for my studio. This now allows me to do much more direct recording and flexibility. Thanks again for watching. Stay reckless.